Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Inzá Pink Wash Process Colombia from Say Coffee. There's the box right there. And Say, based out of Brooklyn, New York. And they're a coffee roaster that appears on this channel from time to time throughout the year, usually when they release something that does catch our interest. However, there are times where we pick up one of their coffees out of desperation or necessity, usually when we are waiting on an order to arrive, as is the case with this coffee right here, as there wasn't anything particularly unique or interesting sounding about this coffee to me. However, sometimes you can be surprised by a coffee that you didn't have a lot of expectation for, so we will see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 50. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee, as we've alluded to in our recent Say reviews, they do still roast on the lighter side of things, if maybe not to the same extent as they once used to roast. This coffee right here does seem to go along with that trend once again, as this coffee is still a pretty light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 28, first impression, and we opted for the V60 while the cup came out a little bit more flavorful and vibrant than initially expected, with plenty of the citric bright characteristics as well as a bit of a candied sweetness to the cup. In addition to that, it offered a lingering citric finish with a complementary herbality as well. So it was a good start. I think it was pretty in line with a lot of my expectations for it, if maybe a little bit more citric forward than even I was expecting. Day 31 opted for the Chemex, and we had pretty similar results, as it was very reminiscent of a lot of Kenyan coffees with a refreshing citric aspect to it, and plenty of the berry brightness with a complementary herbal florality. So I have a hibiscus nut list on here, and that was definitely one of the more abundant qualities within it, especially on these earlier days. A little bit less of the candied sweetness from the previous day, but overall some nice clarity in general, as it seemed to kind of reduce some of the savory qualities that you experienced from the Kenyan coffees while still offering a lot of the other characteristics that they have. Day 34 opted for the April brewer, and the cup continues to remain well above expectations in the sense that it's offering the above expected level of sweetness in a candied sense, with a very vibrant and long-lasting, well-defined lime attributes to the cup that actually does linger for quite a bit, as this is one of those coffees that seems to have a very long-lasting finish to it. It is reminiscent of a floral citric fruit tea with a bit of bitterness, as the fruits are giving off plenty of the pink Bourbon characteristics. So, nice experience on this day. We continue on to day 37. Opted for the V60 with some higher temperatures and a more fine grind, and the cup continued to offer a lot of the previous things we'd experienced from it, including a lot of the tart berry as well as citric attributes of this coffee to a near, if not a similar Kenyan level, still offering a nice bit of sweetness, but it's been pretty consistent up to this point. A lot of these notes are going to indicate a lot of consistency within this one. Day 39 opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and I was pretty surprised by the cup because it had been the best it was up to this point, and that's why we opted for this as our preferred recipe on this coffee, as it does point a little bit more in the direction of the candied sweetness with notably less of the bitterness. And given that this coffee skewed so heavily in terms of that lime citric attribute, toning down that bitterness really seemed to help this one, as it had unusually great definition and sweetness for what the coffee was, with still plenty of that lingering, long-lasting finish in the cup. Pretty good day overall. We continue on to day 42, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the cup continues to yield consistency as it offers more of the Kenyan-like attributes with an abundance of the tart berry brightness as well as strong citric structure once again. This is the day where I kind of tried to make a determination whether it was the brew method or whether it was just the timing of this coffee, whether the additional aging of it seemed to help this coffee improve. And I think this day 44 mark really seemed to indicate the overall results, as we tried the V60 one more time with our higher extraction recipe, and we perhaps pushed it a little bit too far, as on this day it was extremely reminiscent of Kenyan coffees with an overly high level of brightness and significantly less of the sweetness. Bright berry aspects with a strong citrus and a slight bit of a less defined clarity to it, as well as less sweetness. It does open up a fair bit after it cools down, but I said, okay, I really think that our adjustments seemed do this coffee a lot of justice as we went back to the Chemex on day 47, and it still offers plenty of those citric intense attributes to it, as it has become the most dominant aspect of the cup. Not that it wasn't right from the onset, but at this time maybe a little bit more pronounced, but it was pretty well defined through this brew method, and that's what I kept pulling out from it. Was it offered really nice clarity. It gave you a very well defined lime attribute to this coffee. The rest of it does lean heavily into the citric-like characteristics, canyon-like characteristics of it, with a very high level of brightness, plenty of those berries, and an ever so slight savoriness, which could have maybe been a little bit of a priming effect given just how much this coffee tasted like a Kenyan coffee. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 2 level 5s, so let's go through those real quick. And we'll start with the finish, level 5. So it is one of the notes I had very early on within this coffee, as I took pretty strong note of just how long lasting the finish is in this coffee. So yes, it's not necessarily to an overbearing sense, but it's one of those things where after you drink this coffee, you are tasting it for an extended period of time, as it does offer plenty of those citric characteristics to it, as well as those slightly more tart characteristics to it. And that does take us into the other level 5 we do have for this tasting wheel. And that is the citrus fruit, as this is an extremely citric forward coffee. And when I did see that lime note on there, I said, okay, you're probably going to be experiencing a little bit of that, but I didn't necessarily expect to experience it in the sense that I'd experienced it from this one. I think that might be a little bit more of a throwback to some of Say's coffees, as in the past they used to offer some very long-lasting lemongrass-like experiences to them. This one right here, maybe a little bit more definition in general, but it did skew pretty heavily in that citric direction. Quite a few level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I think that's the big benefit of this coffee being a pink bourbon coffee from Colombia as opposed to a Kenyan coffee, because it didn't have as much of those savory characteristics to it, and as a result that seems to really help the clarity. So level 4 did seem like a pretty nice fit for it. Sweetness, level 4, and this one does have the benefit of being brewed through the Chemex, which offered so many more of those sweeter candied aspects to it, especially with the adjustments we had made. So I would say that this one at times maybe the lower side of level 4, higher side of level 3, but with the adjustments we were able to get this coffee to that specific point. Acidity, level 4. Yeah, and I mentioned in our recent washed Ethiopian coffee from Say review that we were drinking this one alongside of that one, and this one right here offered so many more brighter characteristics to it, which is why that one was a little lower. But as we're circling back to this one, plenty of brightness. Again, one of those things I was experienced from the start. And I could say that if you probably served me this coffee and told me it was a Kenyan coffee, I wouldn't be able to tell you the difference. It had plenty of those brighter characteristics to them, specifically focusing in that very sense. Florality, level 4. And that's one of the other things that we were discussing right from the start of this one, is that slightly herbal floral aspect, very much in line with the red characteristics of this cup. So the hibiscus note that they have on here is about as easy to pick out as possible, as that one also offered some great definition to this one, especially through the Chemex. So level 4, perfectly fitting for that. Berry fruit, level 4. Once again, those tart berry aspects, very reminiscent of Kenyan coffees, present right from the onset. I don't recall what the notes they have listed on here. I assume it's maybe something along the lines of a currant or a red currant, but if it is, wouldn't surprise me. That seemed to be a very dominant attribute within this coffee as well. Then we have one level 3, and that is the bitterness at that level 3. Yeah, that's just how strong the citric attribute was of this one, as citrus is bitter in general, and that's where all the bitterness from this one came, was in that citric direction. I think I really wanted to highlight and pinpoint this one being at that level 3, even though it was toned down in the Chemex to maybe level 2, mostly because relative to a lot of the coffees that we do review, this one just had a little bit more bitterness in general. Last thing worth discussing is the body of level 2. I think that's primarily an aspect of it being brewed through the Chemex as opposed to the V60, though it didn't necessarily have that much body in general, as it felt a little lighter profiled in terms of the body, and that's probably the biggest takeaway and difference that I experienced in terms of this relative to the Kenyan coffees, and a negative aspect, because the positive for me is that the savoriness is toned down, but it comes at the cost of maybe a little more body. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I said going into it that my expectations weren't necessarily that high, and scoring 2 level 5s is always kind of fun, so at least it made for an interesting review in that sense. But other than that, I mean, it's offered a pretty Kenyan forward profile, and a lot of people know that that traditional Kenyan coffee isn't necessarily my favorite unless you're able to get something unique or really stand outish about it. And this one did have some really nice sweetness in general, so that already in itself is a positive direction for this coffee. Other than that, though, not the biggest fan of citrus, so skewing that heavily in terms of that direction isn't necessarily going to make this my favorite coffee, but I would say it was good. Nothing too unique, nothing too special for me, but that was a lot of my expectation for it going into it. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, easy as possible, anybody that does enjoy their Kenyan coffees and or maybe looking to tone down the savory aspects of it and maybe don't necessarily prioritize the body as much, because as I've kind of mentioned, those are the two big differences that I experienced from this and most Kenyan coffees that we do review. Also, if you really like citrus, then I think this is one that I really want to pinpoint for you, as this one offered those citric attributes in such strong abundance, enough to score as high as they did. And they were present, prominent, pronounced throughout the entirety of this coffee. So that's the best direction I can point you towards for that, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Inzá Pink Wash Process Colombia from Say Coffee. Thank you for watching.